The unexpected return. It was the summer of 1993, a time that felt like it would never end. I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, having just completed a week-long training mission. The sun had beaten down on us relentlessly during our exercises in the dusty terrain, but the satisfaction of doing my job, training others in desert warfare tactics, made it all worth it. I was exhausted, but all I could think about was coming home. For 6 years, the Army had been my life, and while it was demanding, it gave me a sense of purpose and belonging. But no matter how fulfilling my career was, there was always that feeling of warmth whenever I thought about the life waiting for me back at our apartment. The man I loved had been my rock through it all, until the moment everything came crashing down. As I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the space felt unusually quiet, or maybe it was just my exhaustion from the long week catching up with me. But as I climbed the stairs to our second-floor unit, a strange knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself it was just in my head. After all, I had been looking forward to this moment for days. Opening the door to the apartment would mean stepping back into the life we had built together. I couldn't wait to tell him about everything that had happened during my week away. The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, that knot in my stomach tightened. The apartment was cold and eerily silent. My boots clicked against the linoleum as I moved further inside, but there was no sign of life. No trace of him anywhere. The small living room, which was usually cluttered with books, blankets, and the little remnants of our daily routines, was completely bare. I glanced around, my heart beginning to race as I noticed that the framed photos we had hanging on the wall were missing. The couch, the coffee table, everything was gone. It felt as though I had walked into a stranger's place. I dropped my duffel bag to the floor, the thud echoing in the empty space. This has to be some mistake, I thought. Maybe he moved everything around. But as I ventured into the bedroom, reality hit me like a freight train. The closet was empty, stripped of every piece of clothing. The drawers that once held his shirts and personal belongings were now bare. There was nothing left of him in this apartment. The man I had loved for 4 years was gone, without a single word or explanation. Panic set in as I rushed to the bathroom, the kitchen, everywhere. My heart was pounding in my chest as I opened cabinets and cupboards, only to find them empty. In one frantic moment, I ran to check the bank account, praying this was some sort of twisted joke. My hands shook as I logged into the account we shared, but the reality was worse than I could have imagined. The balance was $1, one solitary dollar, a cruel reminder of the devastation he had left behind. Every penny we had saved was gone, just like him. I sat down on the cold, bare floor, unable to process what had just happened. The shock turned into tears, and before I knew it, I was sobbing uncontrollably, the pain of betrayal sinking deeper and deeper with each passing minute. How could he do this? I asked myself over and over, but no answer came. He was gone, and with him went the future I had envisioned for us. We had made plans, talked about getting married, starting a family, building a life together after my time in the Army. All of that was gone, like a cruel mirage in the desert. The person I thought was my partner, my confidant, had vanished, taking everything I trusted with him. I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. How had I not seen this coming? How had he been planning this all along, while I was out serving my country? The hours that followed were a blur. I don't remember how long I sat there on the floor, staring at the empty walls, but it felt like an eternity. A cold numbness settled over me, the kind that comes when you're too shocked to feel anything at all. At some point, I must have stood up, moved around, and tried to piece together what little was left of my life. But all I could think about was him. Where was he? Why didn't he leave a note? Why did he empty everything we had? The anger was overwhelming, but it couldn't mask the sadness that consumed me. I felt broken, betrayed, and completely lost. Over the next few days, reality began to set in. I contacted the landlord and the neighbors, trying to gather any information about where he might have gone, but no one knew anything. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. With no answers and no closure, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. I had to leave the Army. Staying would have been impossible, surrounded by the constant reminder of the future we had talked about, the life that would never be. Leaving my career was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. The Army had given me stability, purpose, and a sense of belonging. But after what happened, I couldn't see a way forward. The pain was too raw, too fresh. I needed to start over, far away from the memories of what once was. As I packed up what little I had left, I realized I was no longer the same person. The woman who had walked through that apartment door a week earlier was gone, and in her place was someone broken, but determined to rebuild. Little did I know, the path to rebuilding would be filled with even more heartache and a constant reminder of the betrayal that had left me in pieces. The decision to leave the Army wasn't one I had ever imagined making. It had been my life, my career, and my identity for 6 years. From the moment I enlisted, I knew this was where I was meant to be. The structure, the discipline, and the sense of purpose that came with serving my country gave me a reason to push through, even the toughest days. But after that day, after coming home to an empty apartment, an emptied bank account, and the realization that the man I loved had walked out of my life without a word, everything changed. The days following his disappearance were a blur. Each morning, I woke up hoping it was all just a nightmare. I'd open my eyes and for a brief second, forget what had happened. Then, the crushing weight of reality would hit me all over again. He was gone, and with him went any sense of stability or control I had in my life. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, practical, and deeply personal. He hadn't just left me, he had destroyed every foundation I had built for myself. In the Army, you're trained to handle chaos, to function under pressure, and to push through challenges. But this was a different kind of challenge. No amount of training or discipline could prepare me for the emotional devastation I was going through. I tried to stay focused, to throw myself into work, hoping that the structure of my daily duties would help distract me from the gaping hole in my heart. But nothing worked. Every time I put on my uniform, it reminded me of the plans we had made, the future we had talked about. He had promised to stick with me through my Army career. We had talked about what we would do when my service ended. Maybe start a family, settle down, finally live the life we had always dreamed of. Now, that future was gone, and it felt like my career was tied to that loss. The thought of leaving the Army had never crossed my mind before. But now everything felt tainted. I couldn't focus on my work, and every small task reminded me of him. It was as though his absence had infiltrated every part of my life, even the things I had once been passionate about. I was a soldier, yes, but I was also human, and the human part of me was crumbling. I couldn't be the person the Army needed me to be anymore, and I couldn't be the person I needed to be while staying in the same environment that constantly reminded me of the betrayal I had endured. I spoke with my superior officers, trying to explain my situation without sounding like I was falling apart. After all, in the Army, showing weakness isn't exactly encouraged. You're expected to push through personal struggles and keep your focus on the mission. But this was different. This wasn't something I could just push through. My entire life had been turned upside down, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. To my surprise, my superiors were more understanding than I expected. They recognized the emotional toll I was going through and offered support. But ultimately, I knew what I had to do. The day I submitted my resignation was one of the hardest days of my life. As I handed in the paperwork, a wave of grief washed over me. I was not only losing my partner, but also a career I had dedicated my life to. The Army had given me a sense of identity, a purpose greater than myself. It had shaped who I was, given me strength, and taught me resilience. But now, even that felt like it had been taken away from me. Walking out of the office that day, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. I was stepping into the unknown, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea what my future would look like. The transition from military to civilian life was jarring. I had always been surrounded by a community of people who shared the same experiences, the same struggles, and the same sense of duty. Now I was on my own, trying to figure out how to navigate a world that felt completely foreign to me. The routines and structures I had grown accustomed to were gone, replaced by a sense of isolation and aimlessness. I had lost the man I loved, and now I had lost the career that had given me purpose. I took a civilian job to make ends meet, but nothing felt right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost more than just a partner and a job. I had lost myself. I tried to focus on the practical things: like finding a new place to live and rebuilding my finances. But the emotional weight of everything made it hard to move forward. Every time I saw someone in uniform, it reminded me of the life I had left behind. Every time I passed by a military base or heard about training exercises, a pang of regret hit me. Had I made the right decision? Could I have stayed and pushed through the pain? But deep down, I knew that staying would have only prolonged the inevitable. I wasn't the same person anymore. The betrayal I had experienced had changed me, and trying to hold on to my old life would have only kept me stuck in a place I no longer belonged. I had to accept that my future was no longer tied to the Army. It was terrifying, but it was also the first step toward healing. As the weeks turned into months, I began to slowly rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I questioned every decision I had made. But I knew that leaving the Army had been the right choice for me, even though it meant letting go of something I had loved. I had to start over to create a new path for myself, one that wasn't defined by the relationship that had shattered or the career I had walked away from. Leaving the Army had been one of the hardest decisions of my life, but it also marked the beginning of a journey I hadn't expected to take. A journey of rediscovering who I was, beyond the uniform, beyond the heartbreak. And even though I had no idea where that journey would lead, I knew it was the only way forward. After leaving the Army, I thought the hardest part was over. I believed that once I stepped away from the career that had once defined me, I could begin to heal from the heartbreak that had shattered my life. But what I didn't expect was that the reminders of my past would be waiting for me around every corner, haunting me every single day. I managed to find a job at a local business not far from my apartment. It wasn't the career I had envisioned for myself, but it was a start, something to keep me busy while I tried to rebuild my life, one small step at a time. The job was simple enough, an office position that required minimal effort, but it paid the bills and gave me something to focus on other than the swirling chaos in my mind. But it wasn't long before the painful reminders of my past crept back in. As fate would have it, my ex and his new partner worked just a mile down the road from where I did. I wasn't prepared for how often I would see them, driving around town, grabbing coffee at the same shop I frequented, or even passing by during my lunch break. It was as if the universe had decided that I wasn't allowed to forget, that I needed to be reminded of my pain at every opportunity. The first time I saw them together, I was driving to work on a quiet morning. My mind had been elsewhere, lost in thoughts about how I was going to move forward, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw his truck. There he was, sitting in the driver's seat, and beside him, in the passenger seat, was the woman he had left me for. They were laughing, seemingly without a care in the world. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as a wave of emotion washed over me. Anger, sadness, disbelief. How could he move on so easily? How could he be happy while I was still picking up the pieces of the life he had destroyed? It wasn't fair. My mind raced with thoughts of what I could say, how I could confront him, how I could make him feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But instead, I drove on, forcing myself to look away and focus on the road ahead. That was just the beginning. After that, I saw them everywhere. It felt like every corner I turned, every street I walked down, there they were. Whether it was running into them at the grocery store, seeing them together at a local cafe, or catching glimpses of them as they passed by in his truck, it was a constant reminder of everything I had lost. And each time it hurt just as much as the first. At work, I would sit at my desk, staring out the window, and occasionally I'd spot his truck in the distance. The pain of seeing them together was overwhelming, and it made it nearly impossible to focus on my job. Every sighting was a punch to the gut, a reminder that I was stuck in this painful cycle while they seemed to be moving on with their lives without a second thought. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if the universe was punishing me, refusing to let me forget or move on. What made it worse was that I had no control over it. I couldn't control when or where I'd see them. It could happen at any moment while I was running errands, driving to work, or simply trying to go about my day. Every time I saw them, it was like ripping open an old wound that hadn't had the chance to heal. I began to dread leaving my apartment, wondering if today would be the day I'd run into them again, and if I'd have the strength to hold it together. The emotional toll was exhausting. I found myself constantly replaying memories in my mind, both the good and the bad. I would think back to the early days of our relationship when everything seemed perfect and wonder how we had gotten to this point. How had the man who once promised me forever turned into someone I barely recognized? How could he move on so easily while I was stuck in the same place, unable to move forward? I had never felt so trapped in my life. Trapped by the memories of the love I had lost, and now trapped by the constant reminders of him and his new life. It was suffocating. I couldn't escape the pain, no matter how hard I tried. Each day felt like a battle to stay strong, to keep moving forward, even when it felt like everything around me was trying to pull me back into the past. I started avoiding the places where I knew I might run into them. I changed my route to work, stopped going to the cafe I used to love, and avoided the grocery store where I had seen them more than once. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid them, I couldn't control everything. Every time I let my guard down, there they were, reminding me of the betrayal, reminding me that they had moved on while I was still stuck in the past. One afternoon, I was driving home from work, my mind wandering as I thought about the weekend plans I had made with some old friends, hoping that some distraction would finally help me forget. As I turned a corner, there they were again, sitting at a stoplight just ahead of me. My heart sank, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed. The light turned green, and they drove off, completely unaware that I had been behind them the whole time. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The tears came, unbidden and unstoppable. I was tired of feeling like this, tired of being reminded of the pain, tired of seeing them so effortlessly happy. But in that moment, I realized something. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, constantly letting their presence control my emotions. I needed to find a way to reclaim my life, to stop letting the daily reminders of them keep me trapped in the past. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew the pain wouldn't disappear overnight. But I had to start somewhere. I had to start taking back control of my life, one step at a time. And that's what I did. Slowly, I began to shift my focus. Instead of dwelling on what I had lost, I started thinking about what I still had and what I could build for myself. The daily reminders would always be there, but I wouldn't let them control me anymore. I wouldn't let them keep me from moving forward. A year had passed since my life turned upside down, and while I was still picking up the pieces of my own shattered world, life had taken an unexpected turn for my ex and his new partner. From the outside, it had seemed like they were living carefree and happy, moving on with their lives while I struggled to get back on my feet. But things don't always turn out the way they seem. Behind the facade, their lives were unraveling, and slowly, I began to witness their downward spiral. It started with whispers. I had a few acquaintances in town who knew both of us and were vaguely aware of what had happened between us. Word travels fast in a small community, and soon I started hearing that things weren't as perfect for them as they seemed. Apparently, they had both lost their jobs. I didn't know the specifics of how or why, but the news hit me in a strange way. There was no sense of satisfaction, no feeling of vindication. It didn't bring me any joy to hear that they were struggling. If anything, it was just another reminder of how broken everything had become, how something that was once so full of promise had crumbled for all of us. Seeing them around town became less frequent, but when I did, it was different. The happy, carefree attitude they once flaunted had disappeared. They both looked tired, worn down by life in ways that hadn't been obvious before. His truck, which used to be shiny and well-maintained, now looked like it hadn't been washed in months, and it rattled as it drove by. The once smug look on his face had been replaced by something harder to describe. Bitterness, maybe, or regret. Whatever it was clear that life wasn't going according to plan for either of them. I later learned that they had been living out of that truck. After losing their jobs, they couldn't afford to keep their apartment, and they had no place to go. In a strange way, knowing this didn't make me feel better. I had no desire to revel in their misfortune. If anything, I felt a deep sense of pity for both of them. They were lost, just as I had been. Maybe even more so, because now they were together, stuck in a situation that neither of them seemed able to get out of. The reality of their lives was far from the happy picture they had tried to paint when they first got together. What hit me the hardest, though, was hearing that they had both developed a meth addiction. It's one of those things you don't expect to hear about people you once knew so well. He had never been that kind of person, at least not when we were together. But life had a way of changing people, sometimes for the worse. The pressures they faced after losing their jobs, their home, and whatever dreams they had must have driven them to a place they never thought they'd be. Addiction has a way of creeping into people's lives when they're at their most vulnerable, and it seemed that's exactly what had happened to them. The first time I saw them together after learning about their situation, it was like looking at completely different people. They were parked outside a gas station, and as I drove past, I could barely recognize them. He had lost weight, his face gaunt and hollow, his clothes hanging off him as if they didn't fit anymore. She looked just as bad. Her hair was greasy and unkempt, her face pale, and her eyes sunken. They were sitting in the truck, not talking, just staring blankly ahead as if the weight of their circumstances had completely drained them of any energy or life. For a moment, I felt a rush of sadness. I remembered the man I had loved, the man who had once been full of life, ambition, and hope, the man who had shared my dreams, who had promised me a future that never came to be. Now, that man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I thought back to all the times I had seen them happy, laughing together, as if the world was theirs for the taking. That image had been shattered, replaced by the reality of their downfall. It was hard to reconcile the person I once knew with the person I saw now. Addiction had taken its toll on them both, and as much as I had been hurt by what he had done to me, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for them. I knew what it was like to feel like the world was collapsing around you, to lose everything and struggle to find a way out. But unlike them, I had managed to keep myself from falling too far. I had been lucky in some ways. Lucky that I had people around me who supported me. Lucky that I had found the strength to keep going, even when it felt impossible. I didn't know how they had gotten to this point, or if there was any way out for them. All I knew was that their lives had spiraled out of control, and there didn't seem to be any signs of them turning things around. They had burned bridges with their friends, isolated themselves from everyone who might have been able to help, and now they were trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. As the months went on, I heard less and less about them. They faded into the background of my life, their story becoming just another part of the past that I was trying to leave behind. But every now and then, I would catch glimpses of them. Sitting in the truck, parked on the side of the road, looking just as lost as they had the last time I saw them. And each time, it reminded me of how close I had come to losing myself in the chaos of my own heartbreak. Their downward spiral served as a stark reminder of what could have been for me. If I had let the pain consume me, if I had turned to destructive habits to cope with the loss, I might have ended up in a similar place. But instead, I had fought to rebuild my life, to find a way forward even when it felt impossible. And while it wasn't easy, I knew that I had made the right choice in choosing to move forward, no matter how painful it was. Seeing their lives fall apart didn't bring me any satisfaction or sense of justice. If anything, it made me more determined to keep moving forward, to keep rebuilding, and to not let the pain of the past define my future. Their story wasn't mine, and while I could still feel the sting of betrayal, I knew that I had a choice in how my life would unfold from here on out. In the year that followed the unraveling of my relationship and the painful sight of my ex and his new partner's downward spiral, I made a conscious decision. It was time to focus on rebuilding my life. I couldn't stay stuck in the past, consumed by the heartbreak and the constant reminders of what I had lost. I had spent too many months dwelling on the pain, and I knew that if I didn't take action, I'd risk spiraling into a place I might not be able to come back from. It was time to move forward, no matter how difficult the journey ahead seemed. The first step was the hardest, acknowledging that my life was no longer tied to my past, to the relationship that had ended so painfully. I had to accept that the future I once imagined no longer existed, and that meant letting go of the dreams I had held onto for so long. It was a painful realization, but it was necessary if I wanted to start rebuilding. I had to let go of the what-ifs, the thoughts of how things could have been different, and instead focus on the possibilities that lay ahead. One of the first things I did was take control of my financial situation. My ex had left me with practically nothing, and for a while, I had been overwhelmed by the thought of starting over from scratch. But I refused to let that stop me. I began by creating a strict budget, cutting out unnecessary expenses, and finding ways to save as much as I could. I picked up extra shifts at work. Even though the office job I had taken wasn't fulfilling, it provided me with the stability I needed to rebuild. Each paycheck became a small victory, a step toward reclaiming control of my life. Rebuilding my finances was a practical step, but it was the emotional rebuilding that proved to be the most challenging. I knew I couldn't heal if I stayed in the same mental and emotional space that had kept me stuck for so long. I needed to find ways to fill the void that the breakup had left, to rediscover the parts of myself that had been lost in the chaos. Slowly, I began reconnecting with old friends, people I had distanced myself from during the relationship. These were friends who had known me before everything had fallen apart. Friends who reminded me of the person I was before the heartbreak. At first, it was difficult. I had become so used to isolating myself, to retreating into my own pain, that it felt strange to open up to people again. But as I spent more time with them, I realized how much I had missed having a support system, people who genuinely cared about my well-being. They helped me see that I wasn't alone in this journey, that I didn't have to carry the weight of my struggles by myself. Their encouragement, their laughter, and their unwavering support became lifelines as I navigated the difficult process of healing. In addition to reconnecting with friends, I also threw myself into new activities. I had spent so much of my time focused on my relationship and my career in the Army that I had forgotten what it was like to pursue hobbies or interests just for myself. I decided to take up running again, something I hadn't done since my days in the military. It became a form of therapy for me. Each morning, I'd lace up my sneakers and hit the pavement, letting my thoughts unravel with each step. The rhythm of my feet on the ground, the fresh air filling my lungs, and the quiet solitude of those early morning runs gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Running became more than just a physical activity for me. It was a way to clear my mind, to work through the emotions that I still struggled to process. Some mornings, I'd find myself replaying memories of my past relationship, but instead of letting them drag me down, I'd push harder, running faster, determined to leave those memories behind. Other days, I'd focus on the present, on the strength I was building both physically and emotionally. With each run, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable of facing the challenges that lay ahead. As I began to feel more comfortable in my new routine, I also started to explore new hobbies. I signed up for a pottery class, something I'd always been curious about but had never tried. Sitting at the pottery wheel, shaping the clay with my hands, was an entirely different kind of therapy. It was messy, imperfect, and sometimes frustrating, but it taught me the value of patience and the beauty of creating something from scratch. I wasn't very good at it at first, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I was doing something for myself, something that brought me joy, even if only for a few hours a week. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about finding new activities or reconnecting with old friends. It was about rediscovering my own self-worth. For so long, I had defined my value by my relationship, by the future I thought I'd have with someone else. But as I spent more time focusing on myself, I realized that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else. I didn't need a relationship to validate my existence. I was enough, just as I was. It was a slow and sometimes painful realization, but it was one that changed everything. I stopped obsessing over what my ex and his new partner were doing. There was a time when seeing them around town had felt like a punch to the gut. a reminder of everything I had lost. But now, as I focused on rebuilding my own life, their presence didn't hold the same power over me. I saw them less and less, and when I did, it didn't sting the way it once had. Their lives were their own, and mine was mine. I had no control over what happened to them, but I did have control over what happened to me. As the months went on, I found myself looking forward to the future in a way I hadn't in a long time. I had rebuilt my finances, reconnected with friends, and discovered new passions that filled my life with meaning. I had begun to heal, not just from the breakup, but from the loss of my identity that had come with it. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, but that was okay. I had learned that it was possible to rebuild, to create a new life, even when everything seemed to fall apart. Rebuilding my life wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it, about finding strength in the lessons I had learned. I wasn't defined by the pain I had gone through, but by the resilience I had shown in the face of it. I had rebuilt my life, one small step at a time, and in doing so, I had found a version of myself that was stronger, more confident, and more capable than I had ever imagined. Forgiveness. It's a word I had heard many times, but never really understood, at least not until I was forced to confront my own pain and resentment. After the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the long process of rebuilding my life, I realized that one thing still lingered in the background, keeping me from truly moving forward. That thing was my inability to forgive. Forgiveness, as I would come to learn, wasn't about excusing what had happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about releasing myself from the grip of that pain and choosing to let go. At first, the idea of forgiving my ex felt impossible. How could I forgive someone who had shattered my world? How could I let go of the anger, the betrayal, and the hurt when those emotions had been my constant companions for so long? It felt like forgiving him would somehow diminish the impact of what had happened, as if it would let him off the hook for all the pain he had caused me. But as time went on, I began to see things differently. The truth was, my anger and resentment weren't hurting him. They were hurting me. Every time I replayed the memories of what he had done, every time I saw him around town and felt that familiar knot in my stomach, it was like I was reliving the pain all over again. He had moved on, for better or worse, and yet I was still holding on to the hurt, letting it control my thoughts and emotions. It became clear that holding on to that anger wasn't serving me anymore. It wasn't helping me heal. It was only keeping me stuck. I knew that in order to truly move forward, I needed to let go of that anger. But forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, and for me, it began with small steps. The first step was simply acknowledging the pain, really allowing myself to feel it without pushing it away or pretending it didn't matter. For so long, I had been focused on rebuilding my life, on staying strong and moving forward, that I hadn't given myself the time to fully process the emotions that had come with the betrayal. I had tried to push them down, thinking that if I just kept going, the pain would eventually disappear, but it hadn't. So I let myself feel it. I let myself cry, I let myself be angry, and I let myself grieve the loss of the relationship that had meant so much to me. It was painful, but it was necessary. Only by truly confronting those emotions could I begin to release them. And once I had allowed myself to feel the pain, the next step was to make a conscious decision to let it go. That didn't mean I was okay with what had happened, and it didn't mean I was erasing the past. It simply meant that I was choosing not to let the pain define me any longer. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about my ex at all. It was about me. It was about freeing myself from the emotional burden I had been carrying for so long. I didn't need to talk to him. I didn't need to explain my feelings, and I didn't need his validation. Forgiveness was an internal process, one that allowed me to reclaim my own peace of mind. One of the hardest things to forgive was not just what he had done, but what I had lost as a result. I had lost trust, not just in him, but in myself. For a long time, I blamed myself for not seeing the signs, for not recognizing the cracks in the relationship before it all fell apart. I questioned my judgment, wondering how I could have been so wrong about someone I had loved so deeply. But as I worked through the process of forgiveness, I realized that holding on to that blame wasn't helping me either. I needed to forgive myself too. Forgiving myself was, in many ways, even harder than forgiving him. It required me to let go of the guilt and the shame I had been carrying, to accept that I had done the best I could with the information I had at the time. I wasn't perfect, but I had loved with my whole heart, and that wasn't something to be ashamed. I had trusted, and while that trust had been betrayed, it didn't mean I was naive or foolish. It just meant I had believed in something that ultimately didn't work out. As I went through this process of forgiveness, I found that I started to feel light. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade, and in its place, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I wasn't carrying the weight of that pain anymore, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. The knot in my stomach that used to appear every time I thought about him or saw him in passing was gone. I had released myself from that burden, and it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I also began to understand that forgiveness didn't mean I was erasing what had happened or pretending that the betrayal didn't hurt. It simply meant that I was choosing not to let that hurt control me anymore. I had learned valuable lessons from the experience. Lessons that had made me stronger and more resilient. I had learned the importance of self-worth, of trusting my instincts, and of not letting someone else's actions define my sense of value. Forgiveness also allowed me to reflect on the relationship with a clearer perspective. While the betrayal had been painful, I could now see the ways in which we weren't right for each other, even before everything fell apart. In some ways, the breakup had been a blessing in disguise. Even if it didn't feel like it at the time, it had forced me to confront parts of myself that I hadn't been willing to look at, and it had given me the opportunity to grow in ways I never would have if the relationship had continued. Through the process of forgiveness, I found a new sense of freedom. I was no longer tethered to the past, no longer haunted by the memories of what had happened. I had reclaimed my life, and in doing so, I had found a strength I didn't know I had. Forgiveness had allowed me to move forward, not just with my head held high, but with an open heart, one that was ready for whatever the future had in store. In the end, forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about me. It was about letting go of the pain, the anger, and the resentment, and choosing to live a life free from the emotional chains that had held me back for so long. It was the final step in my journey of healing, and it was the step that truly set me free. Moving forwardness had been a key turning point in my healing process, but it wasn't the end of the journey. In fact, it was only the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one that was no longer defined by pain and betrayal, but by growth, resilience, and hope. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant embracing it as part of my story, but not letting it dictate my future. As I let go of the emotional weight that had burdened me for so long, I found that I could finally breathe. There was a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years. The constant replaying of old memories, the resentment, and the longing for answers no longer consumed me. I had made peace with what had happened, and in doing so, I was able to start imagining a future that wasn't tied to my past heartbreak. The process of moving forward wasn't a straight line. There were days when I felt empowered, ready to take on the world with a new sense of purpose. And then there were days when the old sadness would creep in, reminding me that healing is never a simple or quick process. But the difference was that now I had the tools to cope. I no longer allowed those moments of sadness to overwhelm me. Instead, I acknowledged them, sat with them for a while, and then let them pass. I had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the hurt, but about accepting it and choosing not to let it define me. One of the most important lessons I learned in this phase of my life was the value of self-compassion. For so long, I had been hard on myself, blaming myself for the way, questioning my judgment, and wondering what I could have done differently. But now, I understood that I had done my best with the information I had at the time. I was human, and I had made mistakes, but I had also grown. I learned to treat myself with the same kindness and understanding that I would offer to a close friend. This shift in mindset allowed me to rebuild a healthier relationship with myself. Moving forward also meant redefining what I wanted out of life. For years, I had been tied to the idea of building a future with someone else. The relationship that had ended so abruptly had been my foundation for the future I had envisioned. Marriage, a home, perhaps children. But now, for the first time in a long time, I was free to explore what I wanted for myself without the influence of anyone else's expectations or plans. This was both exhilarating and terrifying. I took time to reflect on my passions, interests, and goals. What did I want out of life? What brought me joy? What kind of person did I want to be moving forward? These were questions I had never fully explored because I had always been focused on the future that was tied to my ex. Now, I was able to look at my life with fresh eyes and open possibilities. One of the first things I did was focus on my career. The office job I had taken out of necessity no longer felt like a temporary fix. It became a stepping stone. I decided to take classes to develop new skills and explore career paths I hadn't considered before. With each new opportunity, I felt more empowered. I was no longer waiting for someone else to define my future. I was taking control of it for myself. The sense of independence and accomplishment I gained from this was transformative. At the same time, I continued to pursue the hobbies and activities that had helped me heal. Running, which had started as a way to clear my mind and process my emotions, became a regular part of my routine. I even signed up for my first 5K race, something I never thought I'd have the confidence. The physical and mental strength I gained from training for the race paralleled the inner strength I was building as I moved forward in life. Pottery, too, became more the act of shaping clay with my hands. Creating something from nothing felt symbolic of the way I was rebuilding my life. Each piece I created was unique, just like my journey. Some pieces turned out beautifully, while others were full of imperfections. But I learned to appreciate both. They were reflections of my growth, my patience, and my willingness to embrace the process, even when it didn't turn out perfectly. As I continued to focus on myself and my growth, I noticed that the pain and resentment I had once carried toward my ex had faded into the background. I no longer felt the need to know what he was doing or where his life had gone. The occasional sightings of him around town no longer brought a sting of pain or anger. Instead, I felt indifferent. I realized that I had truly moved on. He no longer held any power over my emotions or my sense of self-worth. This was the ultimate victory. The proof that I had not only survived the heartbreak, but thrived in its aftermath. Relationships, I had come to understand, were part of life's journey, but they didn't define me. I had spent so much time believing that my happiness was tied to someone else, that my future depended on the plans I had made with my ex. But now, I knew that my happiness came from within. I was responsible for my own joy, my own fulfillment, and my own future. That realization opened the door to new possibilities. I wasn't in a rush to find a new relationship. For the first time in my life, I was content being on my own, enjoying the freedom and independence that came with it. I learned to value my own company, to appreciate the quiet moments of solitude that allowed me to reflect and grow. I had always feared being alone, but now I saw it as a gift. An opportunity to truly get to know myself and build a life that was rooted in my own values and desires. Of course, moving forward didn't mean closing the door on love entirely. I knew that one day I might meet someone new, someone who would add value to my life without taking away from my sense of self. But for now, I was focused on continuing to build the life I wanted, on my terms. I was no longer looking for someone. I had already completed myself. As I looked back on the journey I had been through, the heartbreak, the pain, the rebuilding, and the forgiveness, I felt a sense of pride. I had come a long way from the woman who had walked into an empty apartment, shattered by betrayal. I had found my strength, my resilience, and my ability to move forward in the face of adversity. Moving forward wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't happen. It was about embracing the lessons I had learned, the growth I had experienced, and the person. I was stronger now, more confident, and more at peace with myself than I had ever been before. The future, once clouded by uncertainty, now felt full of possibility. And as I continued on my journey, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I had the strength to face them and to keep moving forward, one step at a time.